Hello and welcome to another episode of the TechTrends podcast. This is our first episode of 2026. And as I always say, this podcast is where we unpack the technologies, companies, and founders shaping Africa's digital future. Today, we are diving into one of the least glamorous, but again, most critical layers of fintech, payment infrastructure. Not the apps you see, but the rails underneath everything. The systems that decide whether money moves instantly or gets stuck for days. Our guest today sits right at the center of that conversation, especially as the continent prepares for the Africa Tech Summit 2026 here in Nairobi, Kenya, where Fincra is the headline supporting partner. Joining us is Wole Ayodele, co-founder and CEO of Fincra. Many of you, like me, first encountered Wole during his time co-founding Quidax, one of Nigeria's most prominent crypto exchanges right at the center or at the height of the digital asset wave. But instead of staying at the surface of crypto trading, Wole made a deliberate pivot to solve what many will argue is the harder problem, fixing Africa's broken fiat and cross-border payment plumbing. Today, Fincra is quietly becoming a critical infrastructure in Africa, powering collections, payouts, and FX, among other things, while enabling global businesses to scale into Africa without feeling its complexity. Thank you so much, Wole, for joining us on this episode of the TechTrends podcast. Maybe just start, of course, by introducing yourself and your role at
Okay, my name is Wole Ayodele. I am the CEO of Fincra. So Fincra, we're a cross-border infrastructure helping businesses and financial institutions to send, receive, and convert African currencies.
Of course, a lot of people, especially if you're in the tech media space like me, since we cover so much about startups, fintech and everything, a lot of us know you from way back when you co-founded, Quidax, which was right, at the cutting edge of the crypto boom. Of course, the boom is still there right now. But again, I think you left that world to build Fincra, which is, of course, arguably tackles, the harder, let me call them the harder, less visible problem of payment infrastructure, right? So I'm just curious, was there a specific moment at Quidax where you hit a wall and realized we can't trade these digital assets if the fundamental flat, fiat plumbing in Africa is still broken?
I would say yes and no, really. So while at Quidax, I think the most important thing I just learned then was how much people were struggling to make cross-border payments. Because we saw a very large uptick from businesses that were leveraging crypto and stable coins at the time to make cross-border payments. So this was as far back as 2018, right? So the idea behind starting Fincra then was just realizing that payment infrastructure was still broken, which is why people were taking advantage of crypto to do those transactions. So the idea was to build a cross-border infrastructure that, of course, further enables that behavior. We're actually very early with some stablecoin based payments, but overall just enabling cross-border payments for African businesses. So a bit of what you said, but slightly different.
Yeah, okay, a bit of both. And of course, you've famously compared, of course, the current state of, the Africa cross-border payments to a broken messaging system. And of course, so you've seen texts are instant, but again, money takes days, to reach, recipients and everything. And of course, I think based on what I've read before, you've also just dropped some truth about, the significant amount of corporate FX in Africa is still sourced via WhatsApp groups before there's, because there's not really that formal market liquidity, right? How is Fincra moving now from that WhatsApp treasury culture into a formal, scalable API without losing the speed that those informal networks provide?
Okay. So what we've done basically is like we built infrastructure that's other financial institutions can leverage to make all the transactions in an automated way, right? That's from virtual accounts in multiple African currencies, and of course in foreign currencies as well, to APIs for um, getting quotes, that's prices real time, and then doing currency conversions in real time. So that's actually seeing lots of transactions move online. So some of our customers today, like, some of the largest financial institutions in the world, helping businesses to maybe make payments to China. These are businesses who would have either been leveraging some providers on WhatsApp or, black market dealers, and then today use very great digital platforms to make these payments with less fraud, competitive rates, and the like. So I would say we are, largely positioned as an infrastructure provider, and several of our customers today are, fintechs, financial institutions that are leveraging our APIs to offer these services to small businesses, to individuals, even to large businesses themselves. And of course, we're working on, currently working on an omni-channel communications platform. Like, what does that really mean? Just a way to take all the data from WhatsApp chats, Telegram, Teams, Slack, and the likes, right, to a central platform where businesses can communicate and also trade with each other in a more professional and compliance way. So, yeah, we're still building more infrastructure to addressing this challenge as you have described.
All right, interesting. And I'm really glad you mentioned APIs, because one of the things we've seen, let's say, for example, fintech launches in places like Europe, for example, they can come to Africa, then plug into, things like, for example, clear banking APIs relatively very, very, very easily, actually. And in Africa, what I think, Fincra is doing is, you essentially has to be that rail. Are you able to please just walk us through the sheer engineering headache, of just stitching together, for example, M-Pesa in Kenya, for example, NIBS in Nigeria, and how, localized rails in South Africa, for example, into just one single, all-in-one dashboard? I mean, what is the hardest corridor you've had to crack so far?
So I would say most of the difficulty is not really from a technical perspective, but like from regulatory, right? I would say maybe regulatory, and there's some technology gaps. So because a lot of what we're doing relies on being able to issue virtual accounts in different currencies. So like a Naira virtual account, a Kenyan shilling virtual account, or Ghanaian cedis virtual accounts, Rand, etc. So in some countries, the framework for virtual accounts is actually not clear. So you can't even get banks that, offer this virtual account product. So we've had to innovate and come up with a product called pool accounts. So which is like using one single aggregated account, but, using different ways, either through open banking or like through like scraping through bank statements to automate deposits into those accounts to give similar experience as a virtual account. So we shouldn't have to do stuff like this, but because, the virtual accounts in many cases don't even exist, we have to basically hack our way through using a single account to, process multiple collections into those accounts. Another big gap there is then regulation, right? So getting licensing across Africa is quite difficult. Takes quite long. Even when you comply with the regulation or the requirements, it's still a very lengthy process. So in some countries, you need to have licensing to be able to connect to the rails, and the license take times. And in some cases, even when the licensing is available, right, the infrastructure from the banks don't exist, right? So I would say, it's just a combination of that makes it a bit difficult. So in terms of what markets, to be the most difficult, I wouldn't say any singular markets in particular, right? Of course, there are easy markets. I would say like Nigeria is one of the, has one of the clearest framework for virtual accounts. Licensing is not that difficult. And even if you're not directly licensed in a market like Nigeria, there are several partners that you can work with that provide like, reliable infrastructure. In Kenya as well, shout out Choice Bank, right? So, and a few other providers. So there's some infrastructure that you can also easily leverage, right? So offer some of these services. But yeah, I mean, Fincra exists to make this easy for other businesses. So yeah, so we keep moving.
Yeah, I love the regulatory bit. Of course, I think that's what has been one of the biggest challenges, especially even just for fintechs who are entering new markets in Africa. And of course, the argument has been, can we have just one regulation across the borders? I mean, we've seen, for example, when Africa or African countries have been trying, for example, the virtual assets bill that's been happening across the markets. We have seen a lot of markets actually now adopting almost similar. Just when you look at, for example, these bills from across different markets, they're almost now similar. Kenya has a bill that's just passed Senate. You go to another African country, they're almost adopting all similar, bills to just make sure things flow nicely. Would you say actually now African governments are doing enough to actually now ease these regulatory barriers?
So I mean, African governments doing enough. I would say they are trying, but there's still a lot of bureaucracy around regulation and licensing. Like in Nigeria, there are just 2 licensed crypto exchanges, and then there's been like regulation for crypto in Nigeria for almost 2 years. So would you say only 2 licensed exchanges? Of course, I mean, I co-founded one of them, but would you say it's only those 2 exchanges that have been able to prove compliance and, do what it takes with a license? Probably not, right? So there's still bureaucracy around the process. There are loads and loads of applications pending. And this is the case across several African countries. Some are faster than some others. But, I guess if the challenge as to why these processes take so more time are made open, I believe that even from the private sector, there are ways that we can help to assist the regulators to fast track these processes, right? But so no, I think there's still a lot more that can be done to improve the process of licensing within Africa.
So you're coming from a traditional risk background at Stanbic, right? And of course, where I think, my understanding of that space is you are trained to look for downsides, However, of course, we've seen you often speak about how having a positive bias, refusing to see African challenges as roadblocks, because, of course, we are African, and if you are African yourself, how then do you balance that builder optimism with the harsh reality of currency devaluations and things like market volatility when you are pitching to now global merchants?
Okay, so it's very important to point out that, I mean, like at Fincra, for example, we are very much a financial institution. So, sometimes when businesses call themselves like fintechs, they tend to abstract the fact that, they're a financial institution and like risk management is like a core part of financial institution. So I don't think that, any fintech should look at risk differently from even traditional institutions, right? So like risk is risk and all risks must be mitigated, right? So I guess maybe the advent of fintechs or why fintechs have, a bit of user-friendly approaches, just finding ways to manage the risk that still maximizes user value, right? So from my point of view, I think just finding that sweet spot between risk management and innovation, right, is what people need to embrace a lot better. Because I mean, at Fincra, risk is a very big part of what we do. Like our risk and compliance teams at Fincra is our second largest team. I think more than 10% of the company, right? So risk management and compliance right today. And, that just goes to the fact that we are, truly a financial institution. So in terms of all the different products that we're building, so risk and compliance is carried along from day one. And whatever innovation that we are doing must still factor in risk management compliance. So there's no innovation in financial services without compliance. So many times when you see this bottleneck from the regulatory perspective, so it's not really the case of fintechs not trying to comply with regulation, right? It might just be in terms of like the pace of innovation or just understanding how to adapt the regulation or the risks that the regulation is trying to manage with the solutions that we're trying to offer. So I would just say like maybe a more open mindset, and those lines will become less blurred, and it will be easier to just see how, even fintech can still enhance risk management, even from a legacy perspective.
Right. And I think, those are the things, for example, risks and compliance, those are things even before central banks across different markets give you that license, those are things they really look out for.
Yeah, very big part of it, yes.
Okay. And, I think one of Fincra's key selling point, of course, is acting as, the merchant of record, taking on that liability. So businesses, don't have to. So for a platform like Uber, for example, or any global travel agency that is entering Africa, what does that actually look like in practice? How do you manage, the local fraud nonsense across 15 plus countries so that, your client in London or in other country, around the world or even New York doesn't even, even feel them?
Okay. So in terms of like fraud management and things like that, right? So it's also a very critical part of financial services, like managing fraud disputes, right? So first of all, from a technology point of view, these things are built into the systems. Like we have like guardrails to ensure that you are minimizing fraud as much as possible. You are looking at transaction patterns, and then when there are reports either from customers, from the banks, or whoever just gets reports whatever kind of fraud, we have a team that gets on that and then manages and ensures that the right processes are put in place. Then in terms of just ensuring like merchants from UK or outside of the continent being able to operate seamlessly across Africa, that's one of the things that we do. In some cases, the businesses might have to, of course, like locally incorporate, right? In some cases based on like the laws of the country, right? But in many cases, right, we're able to handle like either collections, even without them being in the country. We collect digitally and then do settlements to their own countries, right? And then, of course, basically that's where we specialize, that movement of money in and out of Africa. So, so that's one of the reasons why many global businesses choose to work with Fincra today.
All right, okay. And let me just now take you back to, to compliance, because I think it's it's one area I've seen Fincra being very, very aggressive, securing licenses in Nigeria, Canada, the UK, South Africa. And you've also been very, very vocal about the fact that some African markets, a license could take even 3 years to acquire. Whereas in places like Canada, I read you got your license about just 6 months, right? How do you navigate this waiting game? Do you have a strategy, where you keep you keep building while you just, while the regulators catch up?
So, I mean, I'll say that's like it's pretty tricky, right? So in what we do, I mean, like many people will tell you, like payments is partnership, right? So in cases where we have to, maybe where we have like very urgent solutions, we need to offer in the country, and then we're here to be licensed, right? We basically just work with partners, right? And, these are like licensed compliance partners. In many cases, these are banks, right? So they're banks that we're able to, partner with to offer these services, or, other, partners that we can, work with to do that. So that's like pretty much like what we just do. Because, I mean, like you said, in many cases, in many cases, we can't really just like wait until we're licensed. In some cases, we can't wait till we're licensed, but there are partnerships that even still gets recognized by the regulators to operate in some of these markets.
Okay, very, very interesting. And of course, we talk about digital payments, which is a space you are in. But again, of course, we have to agree that cash is still king in many parts of the continent in Africa. Of course, we've seen Fincra moving into the agency banking space with POS terminals. Why was it so important for a fintech infrastructure company to have physical hardware, on the ground? Is it the missing link for true financial inclusion in Africa?
Okay, so just to mention. So we actually, this was, so agency banking was actually an old space for us. We used to be in agency banking, but not anymore, actually. Not anymore. We used to be in agency banking, but, today don't offer agency banking or POS services, actually. So those are old products that we should know.
Also, you moved from that completely.
Yes, please.
Because Fincra actually also just market itself as an all-in-one solution. So you're handling collections, payouts, white label, payouts. For a global CFO, looking at Africa, of course, putting as you always say, their eggs in one basket requires immense trust, right? How do you prove to a conservative global enterprise that your infrastructure is robust enough to handle the entire African volume without, a single point of failure?
So I think just like earning trust of global businesses, right, just requires like consistency. I mean, we've been around for a while, so this will be our 7th year of operating. Right. So many times global businesses would always like check for references with some of your existing customers, right? They would also, look at, your track record. Who are you currently working with? Who have you worked with in the past? What licenses do you have? The reputation and like a few other things like, like some certifications, security certifications, not just from like, financial regulators as well. So there are a bunch of these things that, of course, over time of being in the business, you get to, develop, right? Which we've done, I'll say a good job doing over the time, right? So, yeah.
Fincra, you are the headlines supporter for Africa Tech Summit coming up next month in Nairobi. And of course, we look forward to seeing you there. We're going to be having this podcast booth there as well for the 2 days. So, of course, we hope to now physically just host you at the podcast booth to talk more about what you're building. But again, of course, ATS is happening in February 2026. And if we fast forward to that event, what is the one problem in the payment space you hope we are no longer discussing on the panels? What barriers do you want to see completely, or obliterated by the time we meet in Nairobi?
Okay. So I would say just like the movement of money in and out of Africa, right? So I think that's still like a very big challenge, right? And that's something that would like to have been solved. Yeah. So that'll be the one thing. Yes.
Because it's still a very, very big challenge, right? Because a lot of us still work with clients, even from across different parts of the world. But again, one of the biggest struggle is still payments. So that movement of money is still a very, very big challenge.
Yes, it's a very big challenge.
Wole, of course, I know, as again, based on the brief I got, you're a national fan like me. We have a game tonight, Champions League tonight, the day we're recording this podcast. But again, if you had to compare, Fincra's current position in the market to a football team, or a specific match moment, are you currently in the gritty building phase like, Arteta, our team with Arsenal? Or, are you entering that dominance phase? Remember Barcelona, the prime Barcelona, where, where's the team's headspace right now?
Where's the team? I mean, like we're really just trying to offer as much value to our customers. Really, sports is quite a competitive area. I'm a Man City fan, by the way, right? But yeah, we don't really set out to compete. But our goal really is just to be the most reliable cross-border infrastructure for businesses that want to operate in and out of Africa, either for global businesses that operate in the continent or African businesses that want to scale across the continent and globally. Right. So I don't know who that would be, right? Because I don't know that there's any dominant African coach. All right. So I guess, we don't have a direct comparable from that context yet.
All right. Thank you. Thanks so much, Wole, for just finding time for joining us for this, few 20 minutes we've had for this podcast. And of course, as I said, we're going to be having a full podcast booth at the ATS in Nairobi next month. So of course, we hope to host you and maybe just a few members of your team as well to just discuss what you're building with Fincra and of course, your contribution to the payment sector in Africa. Any closing remarks?
No. I think that'll be all for now.
Thank you so much, Wole. I really appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you.
Wole, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the TechTrends podcast. That has been a masterclass in what it really takes to move money across Africa. Not in theory, but in the trenches. From rebuilding broken payment rails to formalizing what used to live in WhatsApp treasury groups to carrying regulatory and fraud complexity so businesses across Africa don't have to. Fincra is clearly doing the unglamorous work that makes scale possible. As Africa's digital economy continues to open up, it's becoming clear that the next wave of growth won't be powered just by flashy apps, but by the infrastructure that works quietly. Of course, we are looking forward to continuing this conversation at the Africa Tech Summit in Nairobi 2026, where again, as I said, Fincra is the headline supporting partner, and where the future of payments, trade, and cross-border commerce on the continent will be front and center. Wole, thank you for joining us on the TechTrends podcast and for the work you are doing to make African payment faster, simpler, and truly global. And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe on all your favorite podcast streaming platforms, share it with a friend or someone you think is building or expanding into Africa. And follow TechTrends Media for more deep conversations with the people building Africa's tech backbone. Until next time, I'm Nixon Kanali. I'll see you in the next episode.